Every January, I think about the Christmas Eve shift in the bookshop where I worked as a teenager. The day itself would be incredibly hectic, with a constant flow of people crowding in to do last-minute shopping. Then, after we had closed, the staff stayed for an extra 2 hours to transform the shop ready for its first post-Christmas opening. We would take down all of the decorations and replace all of the books on display. Cookery books promising decadent meals, beautiful shiny editions of escapist novels, non-fiction books about science or adventure or travel, these were all relegated to the back of the shop. In their place, we stacked the tables high with books about diets, exercise, meditation and, quote, inspiring stories of transformation. The covers were white, the text assertive and dramatic. Joy and sparkle was replaced by austerity and discipline. That's apparently how we wanted to welcome the new year. Granted, this was in 2005. I would hope that we are all more enlightened now, and know that this calendar-based aesthetic shift is as much of a construct as anything else. Still, it's hard to escape completely, even if you decline to participate in all of this January-ness as I generally do. I do, however, like to embark on new reading projects and challenges at this time of year. Although given my taste in books, these efforts tend to look back in time rather than anticipating the future. To better understand what we read today then, let's go back to 1925. Welcome to Shedunnit. I'm Caroline Crampton. Here are the rules of my Centenary Reading Challenge. I'm going to read and discuss with you in this episode 10 books, together making up 1 century of crime fiction. I'll begin 100 years ago in 1925, and then check in with a title at 1935, 1945, 1955, and so on. The 10-year intervals are arbitrary, of course, but they help me narrow down which books to read from a vast pool of possibilities. My hope is that I can get a sense of crime fiction's progression through different generations of writers and their styles, all while being introduced to some new books. Since I primarily read things from the interwar period for this podcast, I think it does me good not to consider these works in isolation for once, and rather join them up with what came after. Long-time listeners will know that this isn't my first time attempting a reading challenge like this. I first did something like it back in 2021 in an episode called A Century of Whodunnits, and then I repeated it in 2022. But it was this time last year, in January 2024, that I felt like I really found the ideal format with a sequence of books beginning 100 years before, in 1924. Plenty of you seem to agree, judging by the conversations I had with listeners afterwards, and so I thought we might try making this an annual tradition. And without further ado, let's go back to 1925. The Paddington Mystery by John Rode is our starting point. This is the book that the Shedunnit Book Club is reading this month, and the book that inspired me to do this in the first place. You can still join us, by the way, if you'd like. The link to sign up is in the episode description. This slim novel marks the first appearance of Rode's detective Dr. Lancelot Priestley, who would feature in over 70 more novels and several radio plays over the following 4 decades. Dr. Priestley is a mathematician, with a penchant for debunking bad science across many disciplines. We learn in this book that although he has previously worked as a professor at a university, now in his mid-50s, thanks to a family inheritance, he is able to exist as an independent researcher, penning his papers, disagreeing with the likes of Einstein, and immersing himself in whatever equations currently take his fancy. He lives in Westbourne Terrace in the Paddington area of London with his daughter April, hence the title of this 1925 novel. I've been intimidated by the work of John Rode for a long time. He was a founding member of the Detection Club and an extremely prolific writer who maintained a publishing schedule of at least 2, often 3, and sometimes 4 books a year, from the 1920s until his death in 1964. He had 2 very long-running characters in Dr. Priestley and Desmond Merrion, a military intelligence officer turned private detective, who appeared in over 60 novels of his own. Where on earth to start? This project gave me the impetus I needed to crack the spine on a John Road book, or more properly a Cecil Street book, since John Road, Miles Burton and Cecil Way were all pseudonyms used by Street, a former artillery and intelligence officer in the British Army. I found the Paddington mystery to be very pleasant and straightforward reading material, albeit more reminiscent of the late 19th and early 20th century detective fiction of Arthur Conan Doyle, G.K. Chesterton and R. Austin Freeman than anything else. Both the crime in this book and the way it's solved by Dr. Priestley bring to mind very strongly the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and particularly Dr. Thorndyke. As much as I enjoyed this book, it did make me more aware of the fact that the golden age of detective fiction, so to speak, wasn't an official period that kicked off on the 1st of January 1920. Even by 1925, many of the writers we now closely identify with that time, like Marjorie Allingham, Gladys Mitchell, Naomi Marsh, Josephine Tay and so on, were yet to publish their first crime fiction. Agatha Christie was still mostly doing thriller and adventure-dominated stories like The Secret at Chimneys, and Anthony Berkeley had just published his first book this year under a pseudonym that was simply a question mark. John Road wasn't an outlier in harking back to the popular crime fiction styles of the 1900s and the 1910s. This new style barely existed yet. My next book is an old favourite, both of mine and I think for many of you listening too, Gaudy Night by Dorothy L. Sayers, first published in 1935. Set in a women's college at Oxford University, it concerns the activities of an anonymous malefactor who is terrorising academics and students alike with anonymous letters, graffiti, pranks and more. It's unusual in many ways, not least its philosophical consideration of feminism and women's education, and its abandonment of the traditional setup in a novel of detection of corpse and detective, witnesses and clues. I'm not going to analyse this book in too much detail here because, hint hint, you will be getting much more of that on the very next episode of Shedunnit. But I do want to take a moment to consider where this book sits in relation to our previous title, The Paddington Mystery from 1925. If that book was looking backwards to a previous tradition, then Gaudy Night is very much looking forwards or reacting to the present. As early as 1928, in her introduction to an anthology titled The Omnibus of Crime, Great Short Stories of Detection, Sayers was exploring the idea that what she called the detective novelist's bag of tricks could be placed in a less rigidly formal type of writing. She wondered if the genre could develop a, quote, new and less rigid formula that would come closer to the novel of manners then popular in literary fiction. Gaudy Night is her attempt to do this, to create a detective novel that is exciting to read not just because you want to know who done it, and that contains deeper themes and characters. Whether or not you think she succeeded will depend on your view of Sayers and your appetite for the antics of Peter Wimsey and Harriet Vane, but the very fact that this kind of evolution was being contemplated at this point for the detective novel tells us something about how quickly writers began to chafe against the restrictions of the Golden Age style, even while it was at the zenith of its popularity. I'm starting to feel like my 10-year intervals are precisely calculated to skip all the major events of these decades. First, we missed all the excitement of the late 1920s, like the publication of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd and the founding of the Detection Club, and now we've missed almost all of the Second World War. Still, our book for 1945, Coroner's Pigeon by Marjorie Allingham, does take place during the war, so we aren't leapfrogging this epochal event entirely. Coroner's Pigeon, also known by the title Pearls Before Swine in the United States, was Allingham's 12th book featuring her enigmatic detective Albert Campion. At the start, he has just returned from a secretive wartime mission, probably related to intelligence work, and is looking forward greatly to a relaxing bath in his flat in central London. The city has suffered heavily with bomb damage since he was last there, and loved ones have been dispersed by the disruption, but his building is still standing. Just as he's sinking into the bubbles, though, Campion is disturbed by his erstwhile manservant Lug and a stranger, letting themselves in to deposit a dead body in his flat. of course Campion must solve this mystery, and it leads him into a tangled case that involves wartime art fraud, among other things. As with a lot of the Campion books, there are some madcap antics here that require a certain suspension of disbelief, but as a true wartime mystery that reflects aspects of what life was like then, I think this holds up very well. I really appreciate Allingham's attention to detail, since so many of the other detective novels from the early 1940s that I've read seem to prefer to pretend that the war was barely happening at all. Another great leap forward, this time to 1955 and Tour de Force by Christiana Brand. This was Brand's sixth novel featuring Inspector Cockrell, who after the career highs of her great impossible crime novels from the 1940s like Green for Danger and Suddenly at His Residence, is now retired and on his holidays. Two other things remain consistent in this book from Brand's earlier mysteries. Queer-coded fashion designer character Mr. Cecil makes another appearance as Cockrell's fellow traveller on the package coach tour, and Brand is still very keen on impossible murders, of which this is one. Cockrell himself secures the impossibility in this story, being seated reading a book at a crucial point overlooking a beach on the fateful afternoon. He can thus confirm that none of the suspects crept up to their hotel to do the crime, except one of them must have. It's a delicious scenario, one of Brand's best. Unfortunately, the promise of the premise isn't quite fulfilled, to my mind. Some of the characters, especially the tour guide Mr. Fernando, are overdrawn to the point of unpleasant caricature, and the fictional Mediterranean island of San Juan el Pirata is a bizarre setting that dictates a peculiar conclusion to the tale. That said, the 1950s specific details about the package holiday, the still-felt aftermath of the Second World War, and clothes like rubber brassieres are very appealing. Perhaps we might sum up this book as the last gasp of the true Golden Age detective novel. After the break. Don't worry, there is an Agatha Christie on the way. Finally, we reach Agatha Christie. By 1965, her first novel is fully 45 years ago, and she is globally acclaimed as the most popular crime writer of all time. This year she published At Bertram's Hotel, the 10th of her 12 Miss Marple novels. This is one of my personal Christie favourites, so it was a delight to have an excuse to revisit it. This is a novel about revisiting and nostalgia. Miss Marple is staying in a hotel in London she remembers from her youth, and is surprised to find that Bertram's is still exactly the way she remembers it, right down to the cakes they serve for tea, even though many decades have passed since she was there. This feels peculiar to her, and she comes to realise that there is a pervading sense of wrongness in this place, a feeling that is ultimately vindicated by her discovery of what is actually going on at this hotel. This book was just as good as I had remembered. The plot still relies a little too heavily on coincidence, perhaps, but the setting, atmosphere, and themes are all excellent. Crucially, Christie is no longer trying to write a fair play plotted mystery, if she ever was. Rather, this feels like another take on Dorothy L. Sayers' project from the 1930s to write a novel with detective elements that isn't completely dominated by them. Miss Marple's reflections on ageing and memory are characteristically sharp and surprising. Christie was 75 herself when this book was published, and it is a reminder, yet again, of what a formidable mind she possessed. 1975 is really untrodden territory for me. For this year, I have chosen to look at a title that many listeners have suggested for me over the years, Crocodile on the Sandbank by Elizabeth Peters. This was the pseudonym of Barbara Metz, an American Egyptologist and writer in several different genres of fiction. This is the first in a series of 20 books following the exploits of Amelia Peabody, a wealthy spinster and suffragist who was travelling the world after her father's death. It's a historical mystery set in 1884, and heavily informed both by Mertz's PhD research and her love of Victorian adventure novels. I actually first read this novel years ago, at the behest of listeners to my old podcast, Seriously. True fans will remember that episode from 2016. I couldn't really remember anything about it, though, and so I enjoyed getting reacquainted with Amelia and her entourage. I found her first-person narration a little mannered at times, but the twists and turns of the plot are undoubtedly enjoyable. Obviously, there is very little that says 1975 directly about this book because of its historical setting and style, but I do think it represents an interesting moment where crime fiction was well and truly shattering into many different subgenres, rather than there being one obviously dominant form. Agatha Christie had arguably created the historical mystery genre in 1944 with Death Comes as the End, and over the next several decades it became a very popular form of writing. The Elizabeth Peters novels are just one example of this type of long-running series. There are also the Cadfael Chronicles by Ellis Peters, which began in 1977 with A Morbid Taste for Bones, and later Lindsay Davis's Falco novels, among many others. I don't think it's possible to consider later 20th century crime fiction without touching on this direction that it took. Choosing a book to read for 1985 felt overwhelming. Crime fiction was so widely written by this point that I could have had my pick of books by Ruth Rendell, Dick Francis, Harry Keating, Patricia Moyes, and more. I eventually went for B is for Burglar by Sue Grafton, partly because I've heard past podcast guest Martin Edwards speak very highly of her work, and partly because I wanted to include at least one American writer in this project. As the title of B is for Burglar would indicate, this was the second in her Alphabet mystery series, in which each book takes its title from a letter of the alphabet. There are 25 books in the series because Grafton died before writing her planned final instalment, Z is for Zero, or I suppose she would say Z is for Zero, and her family have respected her wishes not to hire a ghostwriter. I'm fascinated by the conceit of this series, as I always enjoy writers whose novels interlock in some way. All the books star a former police officer turned private detective called Kinsey Milhone, an avowed loner who solves cases in a fictional Californian town called Santa Teresa. Again, unusually, although the books were published over the course of 35 years, all the stories take place in the 1980s, each picking up a few weeks or months after the end of the last one. I presume Grafton did this to avoid the Poirot problem of an unrealistically aged detective towards the end of her sequence. B is for Burglar is a tense, thrilling novel that begins with Kinsey being hired for a missing persons case, which expands to become a possible murder inquiry with relevance to drug dealing and fraud. It certainly doesn't show many traces of the interwar British detective novel, but it was entirely enjoyable in its own rather dark way, and when I have time I will certainly be picking up a different letter to peruse. We're spending 1995 in the company of Scottish writer Val McDermid. I was keen to try a book from this time that had a relationship to television adaptation, which by this moment was becoming an ever more popular means of telling crime fiction stories. I settled on McDermid's novel The Mermaid Singing, which was adapted as the pilot episode of the ITV series based on her work Wire in the Blood. The book is set in a fictional northern English city called Bradfield, presumably an amalgamation of Bradford and Sheffield, where there has been a gruesome series of murders of men based on medieval torture methods. The local police call in Dr. Tony Hill, a clinical psychologist who works as a profiler, and he attempts to track down the unknown serial killer. I must admit, the darkness and violence in this book was a bit beyond my usual comfort level, but I was impressed by the narrative propulsion and the dual timelines and perspectives McDermid used in this book. It's also a book that includes interesting trans and gay characters, as well as discussion of LGBTQ spaces in the city, something that I don't think very many of McDermid's contemporaries were bothering to do at this time. Writing in The Guardian in 2020, she explained how this book became a turning point in her career, allowing her to fully earn her living as a writer for the first time. The entire plot came to her suddenly and completely while she was driving on the motorway. She had to pull over onto the hard shoulder to write it down before it vanished again. I'm glad she did, even if this type of crime fiction is unlikely ever to enter my personal rotation. McDermid is a magnificent writer and a very generous figure in British crime writing today, and she more than deserved her big break with this book. Next, we're heading back across the Atlantic for 2005's Still Life by Louise Penny. the award-winning start of her lengthy series featuring police detective Armand Gamache. He is the head of the homicide department of the Sûreté de Québec, and I understand that all of his adventures take place in the Francophone province, many of them in and around the setting for this book, the village of Three Pines. Indeed, I've heard fans of this series comment on its burgeoning midsummer murders problem, with the level of criminality in this small community reaching implausible levels as the books go on. In stark contrast to our previous book, Penny's work tends towards what is generally called cosy crime, with very little violence described, and a focus instead on the gently eccentric personalities in the small village. Although there is a murder, of course, the body of a local artist is found pierced by an arrow out in the woods. There isn't much description, and the corpse is rapidly tidied away as the investigation begins. It does feel like Penny is self-consciously referencing some tropes from the golden age of detective fiction, such as the closed circle of suspects, although her story is contemporary and not deliberately vintage in nature. I learned some things about Canadian history from the backstories of the various characters in the village, but I think overall this book might err a little on the sentimental side for me. Still, this kind of cosy mystery has become a substantial subgenre in its own right in the last 20 years, in part thanks to the success of Louise Penny, and it was worth experiencing. We have arrived at my final book. For 2015, I'm reading The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins. This book appealed to me because I too like to imagine backstories for the people I see out the window when I'm travelling by train, which is one of its central devices. It also felt informed by Agatha Christie's 1957 Miss Marple novel 450 from Paddington, which is another of my favourites of hers, and which also begins with something seen from a train carriage. As listeners will know by now, I do like to collect examples of similar tropes across many different types of book. I ended up listening to this on audiobook, which worked well as it has 3 timelines that are narrated by 3 different actors. One of these characters, Rachel, commutes by train and builds up an imaginary relationship with a couple she sees from the window every day. The second, Anna, is a stay-at-home mother now in a relationship with Rachel's ex-husband. The third, Megan, is the woman Rachel sees from the train. Rachel's life is on a downward spiral, with heavy drinking and frequent blackouts, so when she thinks she's seen something from the train that might inform a police investigation, she can't be sure whether to trust her own memories. Eventually, all 3 timelines and characters converge in a dramatic finale. When this book was first published, I was working as a journalist at a magazine that covered literary and popular culture in some detail. So even though I had never read it before, many of its themes felt very familiar to me. Rachel's troubles with alcohol, Megan's mental health problems, and Anna's parenting difficulties all felt consistent with the trend for domestic noir in crime fiction that became popular in the mid-2010s. Same goes for the parallel first-person narratives and timelines, as well as the inclusion of plot elements about domestic violence and coercive control. I think with hindsight we will consider this novel part of a distinct girl-based canon that flowed from the enormous popularity of Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl, published in 2012 and then adapted as a film in 2014. If the crime sections of the bookshops I go to are anything to go by, these true crime-informed suspense plots are still enormously popular 10 years on. And there we have it, 10 books and 100 years of crime fiction. I think I packed a lot in terms of a variety of styles and subgenres, but I would love to hear from listeners about what you would choose for a reading challenge like this. I'm also going to be on the lookout throughout this coming year for a book to choose for 2025 that I feel represents what crime fiction is doing now, and I'll reveal that towards the end of the year, if anyone wants to complete the century with me. But for now, I'll just say, happy reading. This episode of Shedunnit was written, narrated and produced by me, Caroline Crampton. If you'd like more from the podcast, there are plenty of episodes that you've never heard before, all of the bonus material that I make just for the ears of my supporters in the Shedunnit Book Club. Join now at shedunnitbookclub.com to hear them all. All the books mentioned in this episode are listed in the episode description and at shedunnitshow.com/Whodunnit Centenary 1925. I publish transcripts of every episode, including this one. Find them all at shedunnitshow.com/transcripts. Shedunnit is edited by Euan MacAleece. Production assistance from Leandra Griffith. Member support for the Shedunnit Book Club from CC McLoughlin. Thanks for listening.